Dr. Ed Chang, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I guess my official rank is assistant professor of English. I am a literature professor, technically, though I have affiliations with the rhetoric and composition program in English. And I'm affiliate faculty with women, gender, and sexuality studies. And then I guess I'm on the edges of some of the gaming, media arts kind of things on campus, mainly because those students tend to come find me as a game studies scholar. But my work is primarily as a 20th century, 21st century Americanist. But lately, I have been delving into more media studies, more pop culture studies. So my current work is on queerness and video games. And then I'm pivoting now towards sort of games of color and speculative literature and media of color as well. So that's basically what I do right now.
Wow, so you are much more cutting edge than your typical medievalist.
Well, correct, yes. Though interestingly, there are some, I have obviously some medievalist friends who are also kind of, bridging that temporal, arc from the medieval to the current present.
Well, I know how you and I met, but
Yes.
How did you meet the Middle Ages? How did you come in contact with the medieval or the Middle Age?
I feel like this is probably a similar story for most people, but for me, it had to be generally from reading and from media. And so I'm a gaming nerd and have always been. And I remember in 5th grade, a friend, I guess that seems pretty late, but in 5th grade, a friend of mine was who was older, a couple of years older than me, a brother of a friend. It was like, you seem to like fantasy and science fiction and stuff like that. So let me give you this book. And he gave me Piers Anthony's A Spell for Chameleon, which is a very 80s, stock pulp fantasy. And I just, from there, I just, as a kid, just devoured it voraciously. And then, I started playing role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, and I watched everything that I could. And so that's basically my encounter with the medieval, this idea of mostly from a sort of fantasy perspective, but this idea of, action and adventure and wizards and, all that sort of stuff.
And how do you, having taught not just at OU, and as you said, taught a variety of students from really different interests, do you have a sense of what preconceptions of the Middle Ages or fantasy more general that they bring with them, and how similar or different they might be to what brought you to the medieval and fantasy?
Yeah, I think, there is this sort of conflation of fantasy with the medieval. So that's the first kind of misconception, the idea that fantasy worlds are predicated on what we would normally imagine as kind of like Western European a medieval world, castles and villages and, tunics and knights in shining armor. And that sort of thing. But obviously, most medieval-esque or medieval-ish stuff is actually mixing all sorts of different periods together. So you might have dress that's actually more early Renaissance, or you might have technology that's actually even later than that. All of that stuff is sort of mixed together. So I think that that's the sort of main kind of misconception, is that the medieval is, Disney princesses and knights and Western Europe.
What do you think, whether to you or personally, or if you prefer to people in general, why it's popular, what do you think the advantages of sort of loosening the historical from its sort of specifically historical context is? Because historians, of course, get very particular about inaccuracies and transposing things from time, places, but clearly that doesn't and I think some people, you know, like have an appetite also for accuracy and
Right,
realism,
right.
but clearly there's some other level that people take engage sort of emotionally and
Yeah,
psychologically.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, you know, as a literature person, and this is not my area of expertise, but obviously I've widely read and been trained in other, you know, areas. But you know, the current conception of the medieval, I think, is really actually sort of the Romantic period's conception of the medieval, right? So that's where we get, you know, like courtly love, and we get Arthur, so all the Arthurian legends, and I think what's attractive to people is it's this sort of like bygone era of all of these sort of high ideals of heroism or romance or religious, you know, piety, or, you know, whatever it is. Like, these are all things that are very attractive. And so a lot of times, you know, on the idea of like authenticity or accuracy, I often say, like, if we think of this as adaptation, then it's less onerous, right? Like, you know, I understand then when I watch Lord of the Rings that this is not it's not real, right? But it's also this sort of like stylized, romanticized idea of what this world might be like, and that can get us into trouble, because that romanticization then also has unintended side effects, like, for example, again, seeding this world in a very particular sort of Western European sort of world, right? Because I was like, there's, you know, during the period of the medieval, there was stuff going on in Asia, there was stuff going on in Africa, there was stuff going on, you know, in the colony, you know, in the New World, but we don't often talk about that as the medieval.
yeah. Well, that gets nicely to the next thing I wanted to ask you is like there's lots of advantages of having a sort of um, of in some contexts for having a fluid notion of
Right,
time, and I think talking about adaptation is a good way to put it. And certainly this is where the Middle Ages are very modern in a way that that King Arthur was always a, you know, 5th or 6th century historical figure, whether real or not,
right,
and was just in the Middle Ages itself was constantly reimagined in different
right,
contexts, and it doesn't seem like that bothered anyone.
right, right.
But what do you feel in in the present day, and in whether in gaming or fantasy or any of these realms? What do you think the limits of that? You talked a little bit about the danger of sort of myopia of just focusing on Western Europe as if nothing else is going on in the
Right.
majority of the world. What about within Western Europe? Are there any dangerous sort of misperceptions that you feel as a teacher or
Sure.
as a blogger or, you know, a public
Right.
facing intellectual
Sure. I
that
will
you
say,
feel?
so I used to have a professor that, a Shakespeare professor actually, that told me, that used to tell us, like, every time, like, whenever we watch like a movie adaptation of a 20th century movie adaptation of, you know, Shakespeare plays, like, you know, no matter what you're doing, no matter what time period this is set in, or no matter what you're trying to sort of recall in terms of the historical, it's always about the present, right? So if you have a movie that's about the Middle Ages, it's actually really about the present, because it's the lens that is driving, you know, that idea. And so I often think about it this way, where I look at something and I go, okay, what is this telling us about now, and why are we imagining these things in the world that we think of as the medieval? Like, there's something going on there, right? And so I think one of the things that happens is that, well, let's go back to like the fantasy genre, and this is going around right now. It's been going on for ages, but like most recently, I would say probably within the last 5-10 years, especially since with the sort of kind of racial reckoning that's happening in the US, around like police killings and things like that, is that that fantasy as a genre has always been imagined as mostly white, right? So from Tolkien on up, if we're talking about the sort of modern, quote unquote, modern fantasy. And I think that's a limitation, that it is this assumption that, Arthurian romance set in France. Like, France is really close to Northern Africa, right? Like, you're like, there were connections there, where there was contact there. And that, to imagine that, there were no Black or brown people walking around in Europe is insane to me, right? And so that's something that has been, people are trying to address, right? And it's not like, it was everywhere, but like I think it's this idea that cultures were not as homogenous perhaps as we try to imagine them to be, if that makes any sense.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Um, uh, Shifting a little bit, I think it was 5 years ago that, which would have been 2016, that I was teaching medieval history and film and literature, and we took 1 week, and you came and managed to package a 1 day live action role play or LARPing experience for the students. And 4 years later, which was last year during the COVID teaching remotely, I met with one of those students who was in that class. She was a freshman then and now was graduating. And I was just asking people what their best memory of Ohio University was. And I hadn't even thought about that class in years.
Right,
She brought that up, that
right.
was the thing that she remembered the most. What do you think people get out of, what do you get out of whether it's live action role play or other forms of games?
Right.
What do people get out of it?
Well, the reason I teach, I often try to work in LARPing when I can. And, with the current Ohio like revision of Gen Ed and all these sorts of things, I have really tried to sell a LARPing class as a service learning class, because they're like, what is that? They're not doing anything that's servicing the community or whatever. And I was like, but there are ways to think about that as like, what if we went and did demonstrations for local elementary schools, or what if we did, anyway. But that experiential learning, I think, is a really important part, because what happens is, and we talked about this in your class, is like when you start playing something, I always want to make visible, what are the assumptions? Like, why are you making these choices? Like, what is your character doing? Why are you just so willing to like run around and just kill everything? Why are you, there was like one of your kids that was dressed as a Roman. I was like, why are you dressed as a Roman? Like, this is supposed to be medieval fantasy, right? Like, all of these things. And this, again, let's sort of bubble up to the surface these again sort of norms and expectations about race, gender, masculinity, femininity, all that sort of stuff, right? And I think that's the most important part for me. I will say on the record that I'm very dubious about games or LARPs that purport to be about teaching actual history, right? Because they're like, ooh, we'll reenact something. And I'll be like, okay, but that gets into dangerous territory, because you're like, well, who gets to be what and why? Or why do we need to, for example, reenact certain kinds of trauma, right? Whether that be like a devastating war, or the most famous ones are whenever teachers think it's a good idea to reenact the slave trade in their classes. You're like, what are we doing here? What's going on? Stuff like that. So I'm more interested in that games are a medium of transformation, right? That they allow us to sort of look at ideas in different ways. And sometimes, yes, you get to play through it, but it's really that transformation that's more important. So for me, like one of the limitations about games is I'm a big evangelist of what Salin and Zimmerman call the immersive fallacy, which is this idea that games are supposed to transport you to some other plane, and that you can get totally immersed in something. And that's absolutely not true. Games are always telling you that you are playing a game, whether it's you're going to die because your health bar is going down, or you've been playing too long and you have to like go pee or stand up or stretch or whatever. Or even when a game says, oh, you can't go farther than this edge on the map, right? So it's always reminding you that you're playing something. And so I want to use that as an opportunity to think about, the kinds of ideas that those games might be addressing or not addressing.
Yeah, no, I find that so interesting. And I spent a lot of my college being a literature major before I left literature, and there's it makes so much sense to me to think of, you know, those things in relation to literature, especially when you think of the Middle Ages and how in the 19th century there the medievalism, things like Ivanhoe and all
Mhm.
mostly in the form of literature, but also drama and theater were very much providing those same kind of what you could see as sort of escapist or
Right,
romantic sort of escapism. Um, but then, you know, you always know you're holding a book, or you know
right.
you're sitting in the audience watching
Watching a
people on a
play.
stage. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
I find that fascinating. So I guess just to wrap up, what were, out of all of your experiences of different kinds of gaming and different games, what do you find the most rewarding or simply fun
Hmm.
nowadays?
I'm trying to think because I haven't really been playing. I haven't played a sort of like medieval fantasy game in a really long time. But I have been reading a lot of fantasy written by people of color, especially women of color, I think, and they're really changing it up, or even queer writers. They're really changing up the genre. So someone like N.K. Jemisin is really
Yeah.
great because it's giving us a sort of like uh, retro Afro futurist kind of take on the fantasy genre, which I think is really great. I will say right now I'm watching Wheel of Time on Amazon, which is like, you know, a very, very recent mega, you know, volume, you know, fantasy, medieval fantasy sort of saga. It's okay. It's not great. But what's really interesting about Wheel of Time as a compared to, let's say, Game of Thrones, is that Game of Thrones kind of leaned into the like, this is medieval Europe. And then Wheel of Time is really trying to sort of, is a world where there are already a lot of sort of different cultures and people of different skin tones and ethnicities in the world. And the TV show, I think, is trying to address that. And it does it okay. But so that's what I'm sort of interested in and
Wow.
thinking about right now. I will say, as a game designer myself, I've written a tabletop role playing game, and of the LARP that we talked about, I've written called Archaea. Like, I am actually now kind of going back and kind of backward engineering stuff that I wrote for in the 90s and the early 2000s and say, I'm a different person now. How would I redesign this to be more mindful of the stereotypes and tropes and romanticizations that I have about, you know, the medieval or the medieval fantasy, that sort of thing? And that's been really interesting. Maybe a paper will come out of it, I don't know. But that's something I'm always trying to sort of think about and deal with. That as people are escaping, as we've been talking about, into these mediums and genres, they're also learning things, right? Like, you know, Ivanhoe and like stuff like that are also nationalist projects, right? Like, this is literature that's trying to give a mythology to Britain, you know, all these sorts of things. So that's stuff I'm interested in thinking about.
Oh, that's excellent. And I have read a lot of the, especially the female African authors,
Mhm, mhm.
and Jemison. I've read that, and also I thought of Marlon James's Black
Yes.
Leopard Red Wolf, which I know is what's interesting in some of this literature, that it creates its own problems then, because
Right.
Marlon James, I know, had quite a bit of criticism about the basically to do with sexuality in that novel.
Right.
um but but I just, not that this is about you, not me, but one of the reasons why I've read these books is that I, just as a confession, I don't read medieval historical fiction like it's just
Right.
too. And of
Right.
course, I grew up as a kid reading Tolkien,
Right.
mostly just Tolkien.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
didn't even think about it as medieval, but I don't go back and read that stuff ever because I just don't, you know, it's so too familiar, and it's what I
Right.
work on, and also it's
Right.
unoriginal. So some of the new literature that you mentioned, these genres are, I found myself wanting to read them and engage them because they're so different and new, and it's very recognizably medievalish. Uh,
Right.
but
Yeah.
it's so exciting to have new sort of
Yeah.
themes and
Doing totally different things, or not totally different things, but different things, right? Like, I think we're always going to have the kind of like rags to riches, chosen one, you know, kind of stories, but they're set in very different worlds, and the casts of characters are very different, and even the interactions with like what it means to, um, be a hero or to engage with the supernatural or magical or whatever is also being reconsidered, kind of as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Ed, thanks for engaging with me.
Of course, anytime.